So, as I mentioned right before we started recording, as anniversaries came up, this was not intentional based on our recording schedule. It just happened to land at this time, and it will be irrelevant by the time that the episode is out, for sure. But we are recording this on March 19th, which is the day that at least the air bombardment portion of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 took place.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that's this is the 18th
God. I remember
year
that day
anniversary.
so distinctly, man.
Yeah.
That's sick.
I was in 10th grade, I believe. 9th grade? Ninth grade.
I feel like I was in 10th grade.
I don't remember.
I think I was a bit older. I think it was junior, maybe. Yikes! That's pretty hard. I remember it. I remember the kind of like nighttime footage.
Yeah.
Of like you know, like the kind of green night vision stuff and seeing
Right.
tracer rounds going through the air and stuff like that.
Do you remember the countdown? Do you remember when Bush gave him the ultimatum that Saddam Hussein and Uday and Qusay had like 24 hours or whatever to leave power?
The
The
ticking clock.
ticking clock, man. All the news networks ran with it. Yeah, countdown.
Again, you know, to mirror what we were saying in the Patreon episode about the role of the media in manufacturing our consent. I mean, they were like in lockstep.
Oh, 100%.
The corporate media was in lockstep.
100%.
Giddy.
When I taught my propaganda class a few years ago, there was a whole section I did on the Iraq War and the War on Terror. And I found, I went back, and there's a few places you can look for them. It's kind of hard. I'm sure if I did a more concentrated bit of research, but I was just trying to show for an example for class, because, I was teaching people who are in that age bracket who may have been a baby when 9/11 happened, or maybe weren't even born, and it was very weird to try and like relay this thing that I remembered so vividly watching on TV, and even like going back and looking at old news TV things of it. It's like you can see the beginnings of the aesthetic that are there, but like even there's like little things that are kind of antiquated and dated. But there was one of the broadcasts I found, and I mean, of course, all the stations were doing this, where it was like they were treating it in the preemptive or the leading up to the war. They were treating it like a sports game. It was like a similar kind of
absolutely.
Yeah, that was
broadcast where they would have like maps,
yes,
and they would draw like little like what was that guy that was on all the video, like a Madden, like all right, wow. the United States Army is gonna come through here to the north and through Turkey. Here are the experts. Here's where we're gonna go. And then they would do these schematics, which of course now look really antiquated, because not only was it back then, but it was also it was like cable news. But they would do like these 3D renderings of all the missiles and bombs and shit, and they would have it like fucking circling like in a video game, like when you're like da 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 da, you have gotten the Tomahawk missile will kill everybody, and they would have all these like stats, the kind of things that really would now appeal to just like insane like fascists or whatever, just like these stats of like like how powerful the bomb is, what's the trajectory of the missile, like what's the range, what is it fired from, and they'd have these like terrible like 3D graphics and people like launching it and stuff, and this was just like filling the airtime because they knew everybody was going to watch. There's the countdown clock. At the end of the 24 hours, all of this stuff you just saw is going to go blow up a bunch of people, and aren't you going to be so fucking excited about it?
I and I even remember like in July of that year of 2003, we were all minors. We were children. I mean, we were in adolescence or whatever, but you're children. And then, the news media has going across every, CNN or whatever, which is in like every diner in America at that time. That's really where like, diners and shit would have televisions showing CNN all the time. And again, we've used the term on the show before, like CNN has become America's wallpaper, where it's just like, plastered in every airport and stuff. But they released photos of Saddam Hussein's sons, Uday and Qusay, dead, bloodied, heads fucking exploded, across the screen. And we were subjected to, extremely brutal content when we were that age. And just like, here it is, same thing when they released they cut it off a few seconds before, but when Saddam Hussein was hanged, after his trial or whatever, and then of course it was on like Live Leak and shit like that. So you'd see it. We're children being exposed to this shit.
And the manhunt, the whole hunt. Where is he? And like weird diagrams. I mean, they did that with Afghanistan too. I remember like a number of these like weird. Did you ever get those books as a kid that were like cutouts?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Like
you're talking about the cave, the Taliban cave structure.
Yeah. I mean, that was the one on the TV. In the books, it was like a pirate ship or like a castle,
a medieval castle. I remember the toilet specifically in the castle.
But on TV they had the fucking the cave structure and this like elaborate. It was if you were a horrible corporate media conglomerate, man, business was booming. People were fucking turning in, man.
They love it. They've been killing it ever since.
Yeah.
Because that was when it was just like, especially 9/11, where it was just like everyone was glued to the screen because you're like, what's happening? Can it happen to me? Because, it was the single largest, terror attack ever in, America's history, or I think maybe ever in world history. And, it was like, what's next? And all, I remember, we had like a school band trip we were going to take to like Maryland or, I don't even know, somewhere, not crazy far, but far enough. That was canceled because it was like, what if there's more terror attacks?
Right.
Oh my God. So much for an uplifting intro.
Hey, guys.
Remember the plastic sheeting? The duct tape and the plastic sheeting that they told you to keep on hand?
Oh, God, I forgot about
biological attack?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
In New York, it was fucking insane. Basically, the city shut down for, just a couple days, and then, certain businesses, obviously the ones that were most affected and ones that were literally destroyed. And there was such a rallying cry of, like, the whole, like, the first responders and stuff. I remember on the West Side Highway, there was like a impromptu demonstration of people just like cheering on the first responders. I may have gone to one of those as a little kid. That whole like week is just such a blur. And then it's just like so quickly, if you watch the news, suddenly turned into Iraq.
Yeah.
And it was like, hold on, what?
Yep.
Wait, what? What's going on? That was all accidental, by the way, too. That, there's no nefarious forces behind why any of that suddenly turned in a particular direction. Yeah.
It was coincidental.
Yeah. And that's why we can just end this episode right here.
All right. Love you guys.
So stay cool, folks. See you next week.
Now when I was a young boy, about the age of 5, my teachers taught me I could be the greatest man alive. They told me I could change the world, be whatever I wanted to be. There was no one in the world like me. Every one of us was so unique. I'd not be an average man. No sir, I'd be no average man.
Welcome back, everyone, to Eat the Rich. This is a show about our political economy, late-stage capitalism, and the millionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations hell-bent on staving off its death rattle. I'm Dwight, and today we have with us Shane.
Oh, hi.
We have Chris.
Howdy.
And our dear family member and beloved friend of the show, Cari Hernandez. Welcome, Cari.
Hello.
Shane, I'm going to quickly turn this over to you before I get any more horrific flashbacks from, our adolescence and the Bush years, because this is certainly some content warning on this for us, at least, that went through, 9/11 and our young adulthood and adolescence and stuff. So please regale us. What are we going through today?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Dick Cheney, and the first thing I'll say is I'm going to have to be very careful about what I say on this show, because as we were going through and looking at various things to research and decide what to talk about, encountering a lot of that old media footage, going over the facts and details, I just felt such a fucking visceral hatred, and multiple times I just really just a super amount of, again, this imminent kind of detest disgust feeling, just like the sheer rage. And of course, I feel it for the Bushes writ large. And that was one of the very first episodes we did. And, I was happy we got a chance to do that. And I always wanted to go back and talk about Cheney, because Cheney is not only, integral to that, but I think like his broader like position within the political economy is really weird. Like me and Cari also rewatched that movie Vice that came out a few years ago this week. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
I saw it.
Yeah. There's mixed feelings about it. But like, I remember at that time, the director, Adam McKay, got like all this weird shit about like, why are you digging back through the past when we're in like the real trouble now, from the sort of like liberal kind of cohort. And like, his response was usually like, and it's in the film, and not to boost that movie too much or anything, but the idea was like, if you think like Trump is somehow detached from all of this, or like the conditions that we're in right now are detached from the decisions that were made and like who this guy was and what role he served, like it's really important to keep this in mind, because he also seems to be kind of setting himself up for like a new political dynasty. And he's just like one of the most evil people, certainly within our lifetimes, in American politics in general. And so, but yeah, it's important to remember who these figures are. And it's weird to even think of them as historical figures, because again, they happened like within our lifetimes. Like he's still alive,
unfortunately.
And he's still implicated in all of these things, and yet he seems of this older time. And I do think, in looking at him and his record and his role within politics writ large, one thing that is important to note is that this is not going to be some comprehensive list of every awful thing he's done. I mean, that could be its own series, right?
Yeah.
Right.
There's only so much that we can talk about in this show. And there's a lot of stuff that's tangential to him that we've already talked about. But this is just a little rundown, a little reminder, if you will, of that horrible bitch bastard Dick Cheney and all the terrible fucking things he's done. And with that in mind, let me turn it over to Chris to set the stage for us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and really, I'll make the same comparison I did to that fucking Nazi shithead that we talked about a few weeks ago. But like Dick Cheney, just sort of like a Zelig figure of like late 20th century atrocity, right? He's there. He's there over and over again. So Dick Cheney was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1941, grew up predominantly in Wyoming. He attended Yale University for a little bit, but dropped out without a degree. Later attended the University of Wyoming, where he earned a degree in political science. He was arrested twice for DWI in the early 60s. It was really, it just had to be cake to get arrested for DUI in this, like the 60s or 50s or some shit.
Yes. If you were white.
Yeah, if you were.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he took his first job in politics in 1966 at age 25 when he went to work as a staff aide for Governor Warren Knowles of Wisconsin. In 1969, he became an intern for Representative William Steiger, and it was like soon after that he met Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity in the Nixon administration, and
Hey there, Rummy.
I'm already my like heart rate has increased.
I know. Just the origin, just the backstory of all this, and like just the origin story of seeing like of Rumsfeld and seeing Rumsfeld appear as just central character so early, and how they were pretty much like worked so often together for the next several decades. But so like over the next few years, he holds several positions in the Nixon and then the Ford administrations, usually like in close proximity to Rumsfeld. He was White House staff assistant in 1971, assistant director of the Cost of Living Council from 1971 to 1973, and deputy assistant to the president from 1974 to 1975. So it was in 1973 when Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. That's really serves, I think, as sort of like the origin story of Cheney's ideology, at least when it comes to like foreign policy, because he's always been like pretty much more or less very clear about his belief in the authority of the executive branch to unilaterally declare war. In fact, on YouTube, there's I sent it to you guys earlier today. On YouTube, there's a talk that he gave to the Federalist Society, which is just like itself one of the most fucking wretched institutions in American politics. But it is. That he gave to them in 1990, just a few weeks after the invasion of Panama that he oversaw, where he lays all this out very clearly, right, in his belief that like the ultimate authority for use of force, be it like overt, like full on boots on the ground invasion, or like clandestine wars, like the kind of force the Reagan administration and like the CIA used all over Latin America in the 1980s, like is that's all vested in the executive branch, and that it's at the president's discretion. And so something like the War Powers Act, which says that the president can only send armed forces into action abroad, with a declaration of war by Congress, or like in special cases of like a national emergency created by an attack on the United States or its armed forces. They'll use that, of course, over and over again. But like in a case like that second one, that the president is supposed to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action, and then forbids them from staying more than 60 days without congressional authorization. And so to Cheney, and he says this, he says that this is unconstitutional. In this talk he gave to the Federalist Society, like his position, like he positions this as a move by Congress to chip away at the authority of the president. Mm-hmm. But he says that there's times like the president will he can want to seek advice or input from Congress, but like if the president decides that he doesn't want to do it or doesn't need to, that it's his discretion to take action. Like this is the way Cheney looks at the distinction between the two branches of government. Like the Congress is a deliberative body, like not especially known for getting anything done quickly, but like in times of a threat to national security where there's like great urgency or something like that, it's vested in the executive branch. The president is given authority to act quickly and unilaterally, like in a case where like decisive action is necessary. And this is the pretext he uses to defend Reagan for like not notifying Congress that they were secretly selling arms to Iran and using the proceeds to fund death squads in Nicaragua and stuff like that. And in that Federalist Society talk, he like even makes a joke, like speaking of like lines we heard over and over again in the early 2000s and like the run up to the Iraq War. But he makes this joke about like that 60-day limit for committing troops without congressional authorization that the War Powers Act codifies. But he says that's just giving the enemy like a timetable of how long they have to wait us out. I remember so much hearing that kind of stuff about like Obama's like or like withdrawing troops or anything. Like we're just going to give them a timetable that they know they have to wait us out. So Cheney then went on to he was the deputy chief of staff to Ford from 1974 to 1975, and then chief of staff himself after Rumsfeld was named Secretary of Defense. He was Ford's campaign manager in 1976, and after Ford's loss to Jimmy Carter, he went on to be elected to the House of Representatives, where he represented Wyoming from 1979 to 1989. Yeah, and I was just going to go through a little like greatest hits here of some of his votes while he was in Congress. He voted against the creation of the Department of Education. He voted against. No way. He voted against funding Head Start, the program of the United States Department of Health and Human Services that provides like early childhood education, health, nutrition, stuff like that to low-income children and families. He voted against establishing a national holiday in honor of Martin Luther King.
Jesus Christ.
There it is.
Wonder
he
why.
voted against a non-binding resolution calling on the apartheid government in South Africa to release Nelson Mandela from prison.
What? That's like a slam dunk. Are you kidding?
Yeah, and he was... especially the Martin Luther King Day holiday thing. Like, it's just from a PR perspective, it's just a slam dunk. Just vote for it. Not really, considering everything with Dick Cheney. But and so like also during his time in Congress, he was quite often he was one of the main ones who took the position of defending the Reagan administration during the Iran-Contra investigation. Here's a few quotes from him there. There was no constitutional crisis. This is him talking on Iran-Contra. There was no constitutional crisis, no systematic disrespect for the rule of law, no grand conspiracy, and no administration-wide dishonesty or cover-up. In fact, the evidence will not support any of the more hysterical conclusions the committee's report tries to reach. Judgments about the Iran-Contra affair ultimately must rest upon one's views about the proper roles of Congress and the president in foreign policy. This is the same kind of thing he talked about in the Federalist Society speech. Throughout the nation's history, Congress has accepted substantial exercises of presidential power in the conduct of diplomacy, the use of force, and covert action, which had no basis in statute and only a general basis in the Constitution itself. Much of what President Reagan did in his actions towards Nicaragua and Iran were constitutionally protected exercises of inherent presidential powers. The power of the purse is not and was never intended to be a license for Congress to usurp presidential powers and functions.
Wow.
In 1989, he becomes Secretary of Defense under President H.W. Bush, where he oversaw, among other things, the invasion of Panama, Operation Just Cause, where the United States leveled a working-class neighborhood in Panama City while supposedly searching for Noriega. It was also during his stint as Secretary of Defense when the Gulf War invasion, the first conflict with Iraq, happened. Which I don't think gets enough credit for.
Yes.
Much like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, like also being justified in part by an outright lie about Saddam Hussein in Iraq. There was the congressional testimony that was given by that 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl in like late 1990. The thing about the babies and the incubators.
I was going to say the incubators. Yeah.
Claimed that the Iraqi troops had, like, during the invasion, they'd come in the hospitals and, like, taken babies out of incubators and, like, thrown them on the floor or whatever, like, leaving hundreds and hundreds of them to die. And it's like this really sort of like, very gut-wrenching testimony, obviously, to watch. However, it was ultimately determined to be an outright fabrication, and that the girl that was giving the testimony was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And
oh my God.
It gets even better. Her testimony had been organized as part of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait public relations campaign, which was like not even a real organization. It was like a front run by the American public relations firm Hill and Knowlton on behalf of the Kuwaiti government, which, like, Hill and Knowlton is like basically like a CIA front as well. Basically the CIA. In fact, let me see. Here's a nice little thing here. Robert Keith Gray, who was the head of Hill and Knowlton's Washington office at that time and for 3 decades, used to brag about checking major decisions personally with CIA Director William Casey, whom he considered a close personal friend. William Casey, of course, the CIA director for most of the 80s, and that is the illustrious early career of Dick Cheney before he goes into the private sector and becomes just like a walking illustration of this the corruption of like this like revolving door of like government, private sector, and all that sort of like backroom deals and favors and stuff like that. So I think that Cari and Shane, I believe you were going to take that part.
Yeah, so once Clinton comes into office and Cheney leaves the Department of Defense, he joins the American Enterprise Institute. And you might be familiar with the American Enterprise Institute already. It's
sponsors of the show.
It's an officially nonpartisan think tank, but it's actually a conservative think tank. And when I was looking for the history of Cheney at AEI, the first thing that I came across was like an article written by John Bolton about how Dick Cheney was the conservative of the year. So if you're not familiar with it, that should give you an idea. And as he, withdraws from the Department of Defense, he briefly makes a stop at AEI, and he later joined the board of trustees and then, quote unquote, stepped down as vice chairman when he became vice president. But the other thing that he did during this time was he joined the Council of Foreign Relations. He was the director. He had already been the director from 1987 to 1989 during his last term in Congress. And then again, he was the director from 1993 to 1995. And I looked at a few speeches that he did during this time, and I looked at, the information that the Council on Foreign Relations was releasing during this time in their magazine, which is just called Foreign Affairs. And that's where I really started to get the impression of this move between a government role and the private sector. It's really just like a lateral move, because this is all there's like a symbiotic relationship between the people that are in these roles and the people that are in the government, right? Like his goal during this time was to continue promoting the same hawkish policies that he always had. And it came up multiple times in the speeches that he did during this time. I should have said what the Council of Foreign Relations does. But either way, during the time that he headed the Council on Foreign Relations, it promoted like hawkish policies, and it had a particular interest towards the Middle East. Foreign Affairs at the time had decried Iraq and Iran as outlaw states that needed to be quote unquote confronted by the U.S. And, the whole point here was like stoke tensions in the Middle East. And
I forget if it was CFR or if it was another like think tanky group, but another bit of lingo that came out of that period in the 90s and then into the early 2000s, sort of like pre-war on terror, was the idea of rogue states.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think ultimately Rumsfeld then wrote that in to the like new national defense policy thing, right? Like when later he became Secretary of Defense. But the idea of rogue states, it was like a whole classification system of nation states in the world. And it was highly American centric, right? It was
Libya was really like sort of the like Gaddafi during the 80s was sort of like the precursor, right? Of like sort of like this idea of like sort of this rotating cast of like villainous rogue states, almost like Dick Cheney, or not Dick Cheney, almost like Dick Tracy.
Yes,
They're just evil. They're just evil because they just want evil. They're bad because they just do evil things and they want global domination. Nothing like the United States or anything.
And again, from the perspective of that like classification, the idea was that the top one was like America and its allies, basically. Then it's like sort of first world, second world, third world stuff, right? So then like second world is like the Soviet bloc or like the former Soviet bloc. I forget what the third category is, and then the fourth category, rogue states, are like countries that are totally unwilling to cooperate with the international order. And of course, here international order means like the United States. Exactly. Yes. And I think it was like Iraq, Iran, North Korea. It was all the people who ended up in the fucking axis of evil shtick later on.
Right.
But anyway.
I don't know if they came up with that concept, but just like as you were talking about that, I like looked it up, and there's just like on their like magazine website, Foreign Affairs, there's like a ton of results for that. Like they just love to use that phrase. And one of the first things that came up was talking about like containment of rogue states. And that reminded me of something that I was reading earlier, which is the Council on Foreign Relations first came up with the concept of containment as a policy towards communism, just to give you like a little bit of background on what they're about. And, just basically since the time that they were formed, like the reason for their existence is to promote American imperialism and like business interests and that symbiotic relationship between like corporations and the government, and, just doing whatever it takes to increase profits and make sure that, the people at the top are keeping their pockets lined no matter what the cost is, whether it's like, foreign interference or whatever. So after his years on the Council of Foreign Relations and, doing everything he could to stoke tensions and conflicts in the Middle East, he joined Halliburton. He was there from 1995 to 2000. And this is actually where most of his net worth comes from now.
Mm-hmm. You don't say.
Yeah. Curious.
A public servant for 2-3 decades goes into the private sector and somehow becomes a millionaire?
How could this happen?
Doesn't track to me.
Isn't that corrupt?
So, I mean, even during his time at Halliburton, he, Cheney always paints himself and the people around him always paint him as like a really big policy guy. So even during his time as the CEO of Halliburton, he was like giving speeches related to policy and about what he thought that America should do to further American interests. And I came across a couple that I think are of particular interest. This one quote was from a speech he gave to the Cato Institute in 1998. So at this point, he had been CEO of Halliburton for 3 years. And he said, "The good Lord didn't see fit to put oil and gas only where there are democratically elected regimes friendly to the United States. Occasionally, we have to operate in places where, all things considered, one would not normally choose to go. But we go where the business is."
Oh, my God. I felt like you just like held a machine gun on me.
It is quite stunning sometimes, and I thought the same thing when watching his Federalist Society talk, and just how frank he is about some of these kind of concepts, right? Especially like that one, and like the broad, also the concept of presidential just use of force, right? Mm-hmm.
It's just like so nakedly obvious what his goals are, and you just think about the many years that he spent talking about this and how in the end he got away with it. And it is like legitimately disturbing. Like the other quote that I pulled from one of the speeches that I read was a speech he did then in 1999 at the London Institute of Petroleum, which is, he said...
a very notable institute.
Very, very notable. I love it. Sponsor of the show
I love
as well.
Petroleum. I love petroleum.
So, quote, oil remains fundamentally a government business. While many regions of the world offer great oil opportunities, the Middle East, with 2/3 of the world's oil and the lowest cost, is still where the prize ultimately lies. Even though companies are anxious for greater access there, progress continues to be slow. So he's just kind of like lamenting how we can't really just like get in there and get that oil out that belongs to us.
Oh my God, that was designed to hurt me.
And again, at this time, when he says that, he's working for
Halliburton. Yeah, he's the CEO of Halliburton.
Curious.
And what business are they in?
What do they do? Does anybody know?
Democracy,
they spread
freedom,
democracy.
Deals, contracts, all the stuff we know and love.
But yeah, I mean, really during the entire time that he was the CEO of Halliburton, he still had like a very big devotion to having these bigger policy conversations, which are obviously at the center of his ideology. Like the push toward like getting into the Middle East and getting that oil was just something he always had his eye on. The other thing that I had during that time was that under him, Halliburton made a change to the way that they did their accounting for overrun revenue so that they could obscure their losses. They reported a higher amount of revenue that included unsettled overrun costs to customers that were still in dispute. So like if they had a contract and they went like way over cost and they were still in dispute with the customer over whether the customer would agree to pay that, they would just report that higher revenue, including the overrun costs. And this ended up being an issue that like dragged on for years. And here's a little quote about it from the article that I pulled. It said, at the time of the change, which was approved by Arthur Andersen, the company's auditor at the time, Halliburton was suffering from big losses on some of its long-term contracts, according to the filings. Its stock had slumped because of a recession in the oil industry. 2 former executives of Dresser Industries, which as a side note is the company that merged with Halliburton in 1998, said that they concluded after the merger that Halliburton had instituted aggressive accounting practices to obscure its losses, probably like in the interest of protecting that merger and like moving forward with it.
Which is interesting too, because Arthur Andersen also collapsed after doing the exact same thing for Enron. Just again, I wasn't there.
Just a little side note.
But seems interesting.
Well, Halliburton under Cheney also, like, especially it's considering, like, you know, the foreign policy that he had as Secretary of Defense under Bush, like, then he goes to work for Halliburton and does business with Iraq, Libya, and Iran through Halliburton, you know, governments that had all been, like, whatever, deemed as evil by, you know, the Reagan and Bush administration.
And attacked and bombed.
Right.
Yeah, not to mention, I believe that Halliburton even, like, evaded sanctions to work with Iraq by, like, conducting its business through like foreign subsidiaries and stuff like that.
They actually, if I'm correct, and Cari, I think you might have the detail on this, Halliburton was the company that got the contract directly with the Hussein government to rebuild the Iraqi oil fields.
That's right.
Post Desert Storm.
Right. Well, someone's got to do it, Shane.
Why not?
Might as well be an American company, a reputable American company.
Yeah, they had been involved in like helping to rebuild those oil wells after they had been, you know, damaged or set on fire during that conflict. Right. KBR, I think the subsidiary, was the one doing that.
So, Cari, as you were talking about Cheney's foray into the private sector, right? Like, the obvious question, and the one that will keep coming up as we talk about him, is like, what's the motivation there? What's the logic there, right? Like, what's going on? Now, it's very easy to see what that is if you have a certain political perspective, right? It's like, why is it that a guy can go from, decades of working within the most, like, corrupt and awful right-wing politicians in D.C. in a variety of these bureaucratic positions, and then somehow have the experience to work in an international, like, oil contracting company? Well, I wonder whether that is, right? And so, you know, like thinking about that, right, like towards the end of his private sector stuff, I know Cheney knew himself that he wasn't a particularly popular guy, even though he had this long run of experience. And Chris, as you were pointing out, he was in that crop, that generation of conservative politicians who came up in the Nixon administration. And I think in terms of trying to assess, like, what does that say about their ideology, their world outlook? How does that inform how they think about things, how they do things? Because it's the same crop of guys we keep seeing, pop up here and there. They were all like really bitter and mad that Nixon got the axe, right? and all they wanted was to restore that idea of glory, right? Of the American presidency, to make America great again, to use a phrase that Reagan popularized and nobody else did ever since then. But so, in 2000, he's head of Halliburton, and he becomes the go-to guy for George W. Bush's VP search. Again, a lot of the details about this are obscure. Cheney has never been one in the, to be in the public light. So we can't know for sure what happened, but somehow, after becoming head of the VP search, the decision is made he's the best person to be VP.
It's the calling of a public servant. Man. He couldn't resist the call.
Exactly.
Just when I thought I was out.
So he leaves Halliburton, and, they're sad to see him go because they're happy with what he's done with the company. And as a reward, they give him, and I've seen various numbers to this, but somewhere between a $20 to $30 million exit package.
Very generous.
When he's got to step down.
Which is like, it's so, like, they knew that he was about to become like a major politician back in the helm. Like, if how this is not just like naked bribery is fucking crazy to me.
I mean, you say that, but, Cheney himself said that the fact that they gave him an exit package is indicative of his severance with the company, and that meant that there was no conflict of interest.
Shane, you were right that it is going to be hard to get through this fucking episode.
What?
I got some choice words.
I was going to say one thing that I came across when I was reading about this was that he insisted that for 2 years before he became a vice presidential candidate, his deferred compensation had already been set up way before that point, and that all his stock options went into a charitable trust so that it was like all above board. And the quote is, "I have no financial interest in Halliburton of any kind and haven't had now for over 3 years." So it's fine.
My t-shirt that says I have no conflicting interests, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, the way that ticket was billed, right? And again, this draws upon our weird, past long ago memories. But the idea was, Bush was this like popular kind of figure. He was part of a political dynasty. He had cultivated this whole like, I don't know, yokel image, whatever, middle American kind of idea. And then Cheney was like the insider, the guy with experience. He had been in a number of government positions. So they get into office in 2000 in a very free and fair election.
Normal.
That was, happened to the best degrees of democracy.
Yeah, democratically
Nothing
elected.
weird happened.
More people voted for them than did the other guy. That's how democracy works.
Nothing notable about that one.
They probably did. But there's no way to tell. The probably there is satirical. Obviously, they stole the fucking election.
Yes, they did.
I'm just making that clear in case there's any residual comments about
Someone's
it.
gonna get like really mad.
Yeah. So now we get into Cheney's most famous, a stint in his life, his tenure as VP. And I'm going to say for the majority of what I want to go over in that, I want to talk about Iraq, and I want to talk about Halliburton and what happened with Halliburton in Iraq. And you can draw the connecting dots yourself between the fact that Cheney spearheaded that and had those connections there. But before I get into that, there are two things that I think are worth noting as Cheney's sort of tenure or influence that he had on the administration when he came in. That happened pre-9/11, which were the first were the tax cuts. Right? In terms of what is the motivation? Why do you go back? Why do you go into this kind of weird ceremonial position, right? After you've had all these things. Like, why leave this lucrative job in the private sector? He goes back, and now as VP, the Bush tax cuts. We've talked about this a bunch on the show. I probably know less about this than you do, Dwight, but my rundown of it is that the Bush tax cuts, as we call them now, are two separate pieces of legislation. And the two are, the first one was in 2001. It was called the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act.
Those motherfuckers, I hate it so
And
much.
the second one was 2003, the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, right? And the second one was more or less a hybrid accelerant of the first. So I won't go into that into too much detail. But the first one that was written in 2001 was written by Cheney, or at least Cheney and his staff. He was the one who spearheaded this material. And of course, he wasn't alone. You know, there were the other Republicans in the legislature and the think tanks and all the other people that he had accumulated over the years in his Katamari ball of filth that he was.
Wow.
But he was the one who specifically was like, I'm going to spearhead this, right? And usually it's like a president who tries to like spearhead certain legislations. And still, of course, we still call them the Bush tax cuts, but it really should be called the Cheney tax cuts because of the direct oversight that he had on it. And what does it actually mean? Like, when we talk about it, what does it mean? Highlights are lowering the top tax bracket from around 40% to 35%, right? So that's like top income earners. So lowering that, reducing the capital gains taxes, which, if you don't know, really only affect the rich. It's the people who have investments and shit, right? Because income is not considered the same as like what the money that you get from residuals from, stocks and investments and stuff you have. They're taxed at different rates. So if you're like uber rich, you probably don't even have a fucking job. Or if you do, it's like a make work job where you do nothing in terms of, it's a drop in the bucket compared to everything else. So the real money that you're getting is return on investment. So that was lowered. And then the other one was eliminating the estate tax.
The death tax.
That's where I was going to go. And that was where they enlisted the help of Frank Luntz, the Republican rhetorical political strategist consultant guy who came up with a number of really just awesome greatest hits in his tenure. And the main ones that I have off the top of my head were, the estate tax was turned into the death tax. And that was hammered on fucking TV, if you remember that. That was like, Fox ran with it. But then once Fox started running with it, people had to defend it.
I'm sorry, before you move on from that, I just want to say, do you guys remember in 2016 where Frank Luntz did an interview and revealed that he has a 1-for-1 replica of the Oval Office in his home in LA?
Yeah.
He was doing a TV appearance a couple months ago, and he like shows it off live in this like very sort of deranged way. I've seen it,
and which includes a replica of Monica Lewinsky's blue dress.
Oh my God.
Jesus Christ.
That is deranged, dude. That is deranged. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Shane.
No. I mean, that's and again, for maybe people who don't know, the idea of the estate tax is, people who make, I think the threshold was if your estate is over $2 million when you die. That was originally what the idea was. When you pass on, the state taxes a certain percentage of it. The logic being that the people in your family who might inherit it or whatever, they don't need that huge bundle of money because you've already gotten a certain. It's a pretty logical idea, but again, to reframe it as the death tax, like, oh my God, like you're gonna tax me when I die, it turned into this whole kind of, I don't know, right-wing media circuit about that. So that was the first goal that he had. The second one was he set up this thing called the National Energy Policy Development Group, which they would call by its acronym, which is NEPDIG. Awful. Energy Task Force is the other term that was used for it. And Cheney was the chairman of it, and he staffed it basically with people all already within his circle. And so this was created in 2001. It was headed by Cheney. And what were its goals, right? And if you look at it, it's the same kind of wishy-washy bullshit that you see anywhere else. The eventual report that they had, produced of it was, presented to the president. And it's a 170-page report. And so we can be sure George W. Bush read every page of it and really absorbed the information to see if that was the correct way to go.
Famous academic.
And so I just have from that report, the first real page of it is a letter from Cheney to Bush, which is obviously a very ceremonial thing. But I want to read a little bit from it here. So it says, "Dear Mr. President, on behalf of the National Energy Policy Development Group, I submit for your consideration our National Energy Policy Report. As you directed us at the outset of your administration, we have developed a national energy policy designed to help bring together business, government, local communities, and citizens to promote dependable, affordable, and environmentally sound energy for the future. The report reflects the requirements and philosophy you set out for our work. It envisions a comprehensive long-term strategy that uses leading-edge technology to produce an integrated energy, environmental, and economic policy. To achieve a 21st century quality of life enhanced by reliable energy and a clean environment, we must modernize conservation, modernize our infrastructure, increase our energy supplies, including renewables, accelerate the protection and improvement of our environment, and increase our energy security. We submit these recommendations with optimism. The tasks ahead are great but achievable. Blah, 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 blah. Sincerely, Dick Cheney.
Modernize conservation is one of the most insidious things I could think of saying.
So again, that's speaking to, a lifetime of government and corporate legalese, right? Like, that's just wishy-washy nothing, right? That's like, we hope for our future. New is good. It's a nothing statement. What were the actual proposals in this? There were a lot of them. I'm going to bucket them into kind of two groups to very quickly go through this. The first goal of this task force was total deregulation. Deregulation of all kinds and across all sectors, right? Including, limitations on pollution controls, limitations on, where you could drill and where you couldn't drill and that sort of thing. The big one that jumped out to me as something relevant now, again, thinking about like how this stuff from the not too distant past affects us now, is there's one thing that got proposed through this that it was enacted into law and is now called the Halliburton loophole. And
no.
Specifically, what that refers to is a restraint on the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, where it is not allowed to regulate the fracking fluids under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So all the fluids that they inject through, hydraulic fracking or whatever, the reason why the EPA doesn't have any oversight over that is because of the proposal introduced here. So that's just a sampling of what it means to modernize our energy infrastructure. The other main focus of this task force was searching for foreign sources of energy that could be reliable and dependable. Interestingly, this report comes out May 1st, 2001, and part of it, and then part of later, there was a FOIA, investigation into what this task force was actually doing, and it revealed a map of Iraq, if you could believe it.
Whoops.
Yes.
So here's a map of Iraq with all the oil fields listed out on it, and then also here is the first page of. And I'll just read the heading for this. It says "Foreign Suitors for Iraqi Oil Field Contracts."
So sick. In 2001,
March,
right? In May 2001.
Yeah.
March. It says March.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. March 2001.
Happy anniversary to this document.
It's like 2 months into the Bush administration.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The immediate priority was, again, deregulation, and of course that dovetails with general conservative policy, sort of libertarian neoliberal shift that happened, and then exploration for foreign oil. And just in case, we made a list of foreign companies who could benefit if something changed in Iraq. Maybe, who knows? Here are some people we know who would very much like to exploit those resources. There's also other stuff in the report about how, ultimately Saudi Arabia is going to be the big one. We should focus on that, but, we should also secure some other sources. Well, I mean, not secure them, but I'm just saying, in case something happens to Iraq, right? So, luckily nothing happened that year that enabled them to pursue that policy. And so that's the end of my bit.
Yep.
Whoa, a second. Is that a plane I hear? Okay,
no.
So a few months after this report happens, right, a bunch of dossiers about the, sort of intelligence dossiers about the strategic interests of various terrorist networks in the Middle East, who for some reason have a bunch of money. Who knows? How did they get that money? It's not like all the people involved in this administration were involved in the 80s and early 90s fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan or whatever. But somehow all these terrorist organizations have a bunch of money. They have plans to do stuff. Somehow that gets lost in the shuffle. Who knows why? I guess it's really hard to keep a bunch of documents on a table and to read them to somebody. That's difficult. So, nobody knows why, but September 11th happens, and immediately Cheney and all of his cronies, including Rumsfeld, get to work on prosecuting and attacking the people who perpetrated 9/11, which, as we know, was Saddam Hussein in the country of Iraq. Of course, now, there's the first move to invade Afghanistan, then the weird manhunt that goes on forever with bin Laden. And this is the stuff that, again, we've covered so much on the show, and because I'm trying to keep it Cheney focused, I'm not going to go into as much, and I don't want anybody to think that, I don't think this is important, or the gravitas isn't here, but this is the introduction then, as well as all of the stuff, like Chris, you were saying, that desire for the American executive to American president to have all of the power at his disposal. This is when they can put all that stuff into force, right? So this is the beginning of, I shouldn't even say the beginning. This is the acceleration. This is the codification into law of, the American surveillance state. Everything else that was associated with the war on terror. Obviously, the horrendous torture program. And Dwight, if you had anything on this, I know we talked about it before, and if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, like we said earlier, this isn't meant to be, a comprehensive thing about torture specifically, or as Cheney artfully put it, enhanced interrogation techniques. Again, this is the kind of Frank Luntz school of spinning things to make it sound more palatable than it is. But what it really is fucking making people feel like they're dying or going to die or otherwise feeling extremely unpleasant, to get information from them or to get them to lie or to just say something, or again, just to brutalize people. Again, these are kind of human threads that have been done throughout history, and this is no different. I think what's so crazy about it is that how high up this was not only signed off on, but also pushed forward.
Yes.
It's not like this was done. It's not like this was done just in some, CIA black site that was, never was going to see the light of day. This was a public discussion.
Yes.
About whether or not to, this is a public discussion about whether or not to torture people. And, interestingly too, which was, I found interesting, kind of going through this stuff and reminding myself about how crazy it was. John McCain, out of, everybody, a guy who's very much a war hawk, was tortured himself and came out against this on the Senate floor. And I remember that very vividly, being just yeah, this guy was I think I remember John McCain couldn't even hold his arms up past parallel to the ground because he was, the torture that he did in
the Hanoi Hilton
in Vietnam. But anyway, so I was reminding myself, and I went back to a 2009 article because it was weird. One of my favorite things, and somebody reached out to me in the DMs the other day, asking about how we do research and stuff like that. And one of the things that I find so fascinating when going through and looking at things for the show is looking at news stories from the past and long ago, whatever. Yeah. And because I think it's so informative and it tells you such a story about how we looked at things, how the media was spinning things, how the forces that, we're using, especially with the invasion of Iraq, the forces that had these private interests weaponized the corporate media to manufacture our consent to have popular support for the war. But the fact that it was done with fucking torture is just really blew my mind. Well, what I've noticed too is that in 2008, 2009, when there was kind of a little bit of breathing room and we were dealing with the 2008 financial crisis, but there was at least a little breathing room from the war on terror to kind of do a retrospective on, hey, let's take a look at this. And we're kind of really uncovering and being coming to our senses and being what the fuck was that all about? Here's an interesting article from CNN from 2009, from April of 2009, called Senate Report. Rice, meaning Condoleezza Rice, who was then the Secretary of State, I believe, and Dick Cheney okayed CIA use of waterboarding. Well, I'll just read this and it'll explain it here. Top Bush administration officials gave the CIA approval to use waterboarding, a controversial interrogation technique, it's fucking torture, as early as 2002. A Senate intelligence report shows. Again, this is before the invasion of Iraq. Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice were among the officials who okayed the use of waterboarding, a report said. On July 17th, 2002, then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who later became Secretary of State, said the CIA could proceed with, quote, alternative interrogation methods, including waterboarding, when questioning suspected Al-Qaeda leader Abu Zubaydah. The decision was contingent on the Justice Department's determination of the method's legality. Anyway, so it goes on, it says, even here, it says, a week later, Attorney General John Ashcroft had determined the proposed interrogation techniques were lawful. So, just to show how far up it went, that, like, public officials, the fucking vice president and the then national security advisor that became the Secretary of State, were having the kind of public discussion saying, like, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And then I found a Huffington Post article from 2014, which I just found fascinating. And it says here, former counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke says Bush and Cheney committed war crimes. Check this out. Richard Clarke, the nation's top counterterrorism official under Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. So again, he was in the Bush administration for counterterrorism, accused Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney of committing war crimes in their 2003 invasion of Iraq during an interview Tuesday with Democracy Now! He says, I think things that they authorize probably fall within the area of war crimes. Mm-hmm. I can't even believe he said this. Whether that would be productive or not, I think, is a discussion we could all have, said Clarke, who resigned in 2000.
Whether that would be productive or not.
But it says
Who can say if it's bad or good?
What?
He in fact resigned in 2003 after the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq. He goes on to say, but we have established procedures now with the International Criminal Court in The Hague where people who take actions as serving presidents or prime ministers of countries have been indicted and who have been tried. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, all right? I mean, this is doing torture is a war crime.
Yes.
Like
this but of course,
that's why. I mean, and to speak to again, a point that Chris had made earlier too, right? Like, there was this belief, right? And I think what is also the difference of the Bush administration and Cheney being one of the main people in that, leading that charge. A lot of the other people was that, like, empires do awful shit all the time. We know that. Like, the United States has a long track record of fucking genocide, torture, and all these different things. But it's always done sort of clandestinely, right? It's never fully acknowledged.
Yes.
And, it might be on a smaller scale in certain places and other places on a quite larger scale if you look back in our history. But nonetheless, the move that Cheney spearheaded was, we got to get this into law. We have to have a legal justification for doing these things. Yeah. And that is what is so, like, weirdly fucked up about it in my mind. Like, obviously the actual suffering is much worse, but this idea that, like, and that was the change that I think, I don't know, we've seen in our lifetimes, like, speaking about, like, the more overt moves to being an authoritarian state or a fascist state, right? Mm-hmm. Is, like, the legalization of all of these things. Because beforehand it would be like, okay, we know we do it, and maybe we'd be prosecuted about it, and people will cover it up, whatever, blah, blah. This was just like, and again, the wording you used, Chris, it was just like, he's so frank.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, let's go out. Let's tell the people we're gonna torture them, and it'll be legal because this is the United States.
Shane, that's really good.
That is pretty good. Yeah,
I've been working on it for about 30 years. Okay.
I was gonna say what that reminded me of what you were just talking about was you brought this up the other day when he was interviewed by Chuck Todd, and he asked him, like, it was found that 25% of the people that these quote unquote advanced interrogation techniques were used on were actually innocent. Mm. Is that too high? Is it worth it? And he basically said, like, yeah, it doesn't matter as long as we achieve our objectives. Like, who cares?
Exactly. there's no veil to it, which is, again, in terms of looking back to this, is, I get so frustrated in the last 4 years when everybody's talking about, like, oh my God, Trump is this, like, new radical thing that we've never seen before, whatever. He's claiming, in the Patreon episode we recorded, Chris, he said, like, oh, liberals love laws. So the reason why they hated Trump is he flouted the laws. The difference between Trump and, like, Cheney, or, in the Bush administration, is they just made the illegal shit they were doing into law. Yeah. They made legal arguments for it, which is a weird roundabout intellectual step, which the Trump version of that is just like, who even cares? I rule by diktat. Whatever I say is just law.
To that point, I want to close this by saying that in 2002, in August of 2002, this is when it was enacted, speaking of The Hague, the Congress of the United States passed the American Service Members Protection Act. Now, what is this? And it says it was an amendment to the 2002 Supplemental Appropriations Act for further recovery from and response to terrorist attacks in the United States. But basically, what the ASPA does is it authorizes the President of the United States to use all means necessary, quoting here, to use all means necessary and appropriate to bring about the release of any U.S. or allied personnel being detained or imprisoned by, on behalf of, or at the request of the International Criminal Court. Mm-hmm. What does this mean? It means that the United States, in the getting ready for doing all the fucking crimes that they're war crimes that they're bound to do, cannot be held accountable by the International Criminal Court. I should mention that this passed the Senate on June 7, 2002, with a majority vote of 71 to 22. One of the Democrats that voted for this is now President Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also worth mentioning, to tie this back to our earlier episode that we did on the Bush family. This happened to coincide with the lawsuit that was brought against the George W. Bush and the Bush family for their participation in, like, Nazi the Nazi financing and crimes. and it just so happened that right after that happened, it was like, oh, okay, actually, the people in the United States can't be held accountable for anything awful that they've ever done, especially not in the international criminal courts. I didn't even get to the meat. This is just the fucking...
Are you going to talk more about the torture stuff? Because if not, I did want to talk about one thing that I came across.
No, please.
So
go ahead.
Just to
let's make it 4 hours. Let's go.
It's really quick.
I'm sorry. Chuck Schumer voted for it too. Sorry, please continue.
Of course he did. I just wanted to, say that in the last couple of years, Cheney has really, changed his line on this stuff, and he's really sorry about the advanced interrogation techniques. Just kidding. And in 2018, not on Fox Business, as recently as 2018, he was being interviewed, I think, because they were talking about Trump's nominee to be the CIA director, and of course, they brought up the torture and stuff. Yeah. And he, he clarified that, by the way, that stuff was all deemed legal. Very cool, very legal stuff. And he literally said, I'd do it again. Yep. He literally said, I'd do it again. If it were my call, I would bring it back. I would study them. It would be active and ready to go. People want to act like this was torture, but if it were my call, I'd do it again. So just no remorse. Okay,
again, this speaks to the interesting rhetorical difference that is, that the liberal media class made such a hill out of. Trump, in his campaign in 2016, was like, torture, we should just torture him, right, guys? We should bring back the torture. Bring it back. He literally said that, and everybody said, oh my God, this is unprecedented. Nobody's ever done this before. This is not at all like the stalwart presidents and statesmen we had, like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, who made it law that you could torture. And then in the same breath, in the same time frame, Cheney comes back. He's like, yeah, actually, we should torture everybody again. If it's a possibility, I would like to torture you right now to find out any information
Shane, This is so good, Shane.
I've never even done this before right now, and I'm realizing
he's literally never done it. You do so many voices,
but I can tell that there's a deep intimacy and contempt that allows you to embody
so much. Okay, so
I know, I see it.
Again, let's get to the main course here.
Hello, comrades. This is Dwight here. Turns out when you spend an entire lifetime making sure that you are inflicting misery on everybody around you as well as those across the world, there's a lot to cover. So with your permission, we'd like to split this up into a two-parter with the second episode releasing next week. I'd be lying if I said that the content that you'll hear next week isn't as gag-inducingly hideous as the stuff that you just heard, so be prepared for that one. Until then, stay cool, folks. Till next time. Cheers. Till next time. Cheers. Till next time. Cheers.